It's already 10 a.m. They didn't ask me to start. I'm very pleased. My name is Michał Szymanowski and I'm very glad to be here at the forum for the second time. Some of you may remember that even taught here in Łódź for a year. It's a bit of a sentimental journey for me to be back here. Usually I sat on the other side and listened to piano exams, and now I'm here and I wanted to tell you about Ignacy and Paderewski's early works. I must admit that for some time now, I have been strongly connected with Paderewski's persona, but it wasn't always like that. It wasn't love at first sight, that I immediately wanted to play Paderewski, quite the opposite. When I was in high school or even during my studies, I had this stereotype that Paderewski's work is rather of average quality, and that I wasn't particularly interested in getting to know his compositions. However, I studied in Bydgoszcz, and there is the Ignacy and Paderewski competition there, and to participate in it, you need to prepare at least 2 miniatures by this composer. So, somewhat reluctantly, I learned these 2 miniatures. And now when I look back, because it was in 2010, 14 years ago, how did it happen that I am now so connected with Paderewski? Because I play his concerto, I play his fantasia, most of his solo repertoire. I also recently recorded an album with early Paderewski miniatures. I also became the artistic director of an international festival in Warsaw. How did it actually happen, this Paderewski? I have the impression that in some way I have some, you could say, connection with him. I have the feeling that these pieces chose me, not that I chose Paderewski. It all started in 2010 when I was preparing for Paderewski competition and became a laureate of this competition. Although I didn't win it because I took the 3rd place, but I was the best Pole, and indeed everyone expected me to play Paderewski.
Między innymi od Bogusława Kaczyńskiego, który prowadził audycję o Paderewskim i cały czas mnie zachęcał.
He hosted the program of Paderewski and constantly encouraged me to learn another piece. I also received an invitation to play Paderewski's piano concerto in A minor at the Chopin at his Europe festival, which was a great honor for me as a student at the time. And so gradually Paderewski's pieces found their place on my first album, on the second one, and just as I mentioned recently, last year I recorded the whole collection of early miniatures by the composer, Opus 1, Opus 9. And I would like to tell you about these early works because I think they are really beautiful pieces. I was surprised myself, and often when I perform these competitions at concerts, people say, we didn't know that Paderewski wrote so well, and I must admit that I myself did not know about it. And it is these early pieces by Paderewski that I would like to tell you about. What surprised me the most when I was writing my dissertation on Paderewski was the fact that he primarily saw himself as a creator. We always think of Paderewski as a great piano virtuoso. Indeed, the first star of a large format when it comes to pianism. However, for many years, and even throughout his illustrious career, his tours in the United States, he saw himself as a composer. And that's what I would like to tell you about. And here are some photos, as well as sometimes I was characterized as Paderewski together with 𝗍𝗍 or during various concerts. In general, it can be said that we are currently witnessing a renaissance of Paderewski's work. More and more of his music is being performed. More and more is being written, which is also related to new sources, new positions. Among them are excellent books by 𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍𝗍, Paderewski and his works, The History of Works and Personality of the Composer, and Bogusław Raba's Between Romanticism and Modernism, the compositional work of Ignacy and Paderewski. There are also more and more new recordings, excellent performances, including those by the National Frederick Chopin Institute. Kevin Kenner recorded his sonata in E-flat minor, 𝗏𝗏, the piano concerto, and also his miniatures. Indeed, outstanding pianists are beginning to perform his works, and hence this new perception. And what I just mentioned, Paderewski didn't like to practice. He hated to practice and considered it a very secondary thing. And even at the end of his life, he confessed that composing gave him the greatest happiness and satisfaction. In 2003, he resigned from concert invitations and devoted himself exclusively to composition, creating his most mature works. Describing this period in his memoirs, he recalled, "I've never experienced greater satisfaction in my artistic career than during that year, because what gives the greatest happiness in life is creative work." And even earlier, he wrote to his wife, Helena Górska, "I would like only to make a small sum of money, then stop public appearances and devote myself solely to composition. Drumming scales and etudes have disgusted me." I think you can also identify with this here. No one likes to play scales. And here's one last memory from his memoirs. "When composing, one lives in a special atmosphere that actually excludes everything else. Above all, it excludes practice, which, honestly speaking, is like shoveling work, ordinary drudgery. This constant need for practice is a tragic aspect of the musician's life."
Przejdźmy zatem do właśnie utworów.
Let's move on to Paderewski's works from the early period, from Opus 1. But interestingly, the Prelude, Caprice and Minuet in G minor, which are part of two Opus 1 pieces, 𝗏𝗏𝗏 Opus 1, are neither the first nor even the earliest works of Paderewski. These first compositions were not even written for piano, but for a trio for cello, violin, piano. And this was related to a tour that the young Paderewski went on with his friends to Russia, with great hopes and expectations. However, the tour turned out to be a complete failure. They returned, you could say, broke. But what was the positive about this trip was that Paderewski wrote some pieces for these concerts for friends, including these trio pieces. And it turned out that he was quite good at it, and he began to think of himself as a composer. However, Opus 1, the Prelude Caprice, is part of the E-flat major suite, also in that key, and individual parts were only published separately in 1885, over 10 years later. And interestingly, as with Chopin's concertos, when the F minor concerto was created first, although it was opus-wise later. Two Opus 1 pieces were published almost simultaneously, with the sonata for violin and piano in A minor, Opus 13, and the concert Humoresques, including the famous minuet in G major, Opus 14. So indeed, Opus 13, 14, and 1 were published almost concurrently, so these opus numbers do not always match. The Prelude Caprice is a very original piece, a combination of a somewhat baroque form with romantic capriciousness, freedom. There is a lot of imitative polyphony, thematic work, and a very large number of ornaments. But this romantic grandeur is also characterized by the use of extreme piano registers and dynamics. You can see it on the first page. It starts pianissimo, there are piano pianissimos up to forte fortissimo. So the dynamic range is huge. And the piece starts mysteriously with a theme in a low register, somewhat reminiscent of a fugue or invention, because the theme appears in subsequent voices. Let's listen to a snippet of this composition. The Prelude Caprice by Ignacy Paderewski from the cycle of two Opus 1 pieces.
Taki fragment właśnie.
Such a fragment of the Prelude Caprice.
To, na co warto
What is worth noting already in this piece are elements of organization, which will become, you could say, Paderewski's hallmark. To mention just his concert humoresques à l'antique, which I think you are familiar with, namely the minuet, saraband. What is so important is that Paderewski, throughout his work, willingly reached for formal patterns such as toccata, prelude, suite, saraband, or gavotte. And these elements of organization are not only manifested in the choice of form, but also in the musical language, specific texture, used modalisms, ornaments, melodic harmonic phrases, or modulations. Let's move on to the second piece of the cycle, Minuet in G minor. This piece exists in two versions. The first was created in 1879, and the very beginning, you could say, of Paderewski's compositional career, and also was part of the unpublished E-flat major suite 1 mentioned. Paderewski recomposed, changed, and in slightly more attractive form, released it almost 10 years later, in 1886, along with the Prelude Caprice, as two Opus 1 pieces. This is not the only piece in Paderewski's work. He also wrote two other minuets. The famous G major minuet, which I already mentioned, from the concert humoresque cycle, and also closing the Miscellanea cycle, the A major minuet, Opus 16, number 7. As I mentioned regarding the prelude, the choice of this classical dance form is not accidental. Paderewski often reached for these classic old forms and genres. The G major minuet is a charming, skillfully crafted miniature with virtuosic, ornament-filled middle section. I will perform it at today's concert. Here's just a short excerpt so you can see what it's like. Just a fragment. The next piece I'd like to tell you about is the E-flat major burlesque. This is part of the E-flat major suite from 1879, which was not published as a suite during the composer's lifetime. It was only put together by Małgorzata Perkowska-Waszek about 20 years ago. This wasn't easy at all because it turned out that individual parts of the suite were written on different music paper with different ink, different calligraphy from different years. So it was really difficult to assemble. However, this piece, in its new Paderewski edition, is Opus 1A. And from this suite, the burlesque seemed to be the most interesting. It's a characteristic miniature, a kind of combination of a rondo and toccata, light, witty, humorous, sometimes slightly exaggerated, but also not devoid of refinement and quite demanding pianistically. There are a lot of leaps and other pianistic attractions. This piece was created almost simultaneously with the G minor minuet, with the first version of this piece from around 1879, and Paderewski performed it in Warsaw on his 19th birthday, so he was a young composer. And from the accounts of this concert, we know that the two pieces were the most liked. It was the G minor minuet, which you just heard, and the E-flat major burlesque. What's interesting here, when I sometimes talk about these pieces in school, in music schools, or one boy came up to me and said, "I know this piece." I was so surprised. How could he know the E-flat major burlesque, he says. But I know that Mr. Paderewski wrote music for Peppa Pig. If you listen, there is indeed a very similar motive in the main theme. So you could say that Paderewski was a precursor of music for children's cartoons. So here's a snippet of the E-flat major burlesque from the E-flat major suite by Ignacy and Paderewski. What I would also like to point out is that we have already listened to 3 pieces by Paderewski, and the main criticism that can often be heard regarding Paderewski's work is that he imitated Chopin, that he was a Chopin epigon, and that he actually didn't come up with anything new. On the example of these 3 pieces, you may notice, even from these short fragments, that there are actually no Chopin influences. Indeed, Ignacy Paderewski from the beginning showed elements of an individual compositional language, his own true style. There are characteristic elements such as already mentioned elements of organization, reaching for old formal patterns, also a certain imitative work, thematic work are quite characteristic. However, we did not find Chopin influences in these pieces. The next piece is a very special one, the B-flat minor elegy, which Paderewski wrote for his first wife, Antonina Korsak-Paderewska, who died in childbirth in 1880, leaving Paderewski with their disabled son, Alfred. The piece was composed shortly after these dramatic events in December 1880, and Paderewski placed a dedication on the title page of the composition, "To You." The elegy was also the first piece by Paderewski to be published in Berlin by the publishing house 𝗏𝗏, which from that moment on became the composer's regular publisher. The piece was printed 2 years after it was written, together with the Polish dance cycle Opus 5, which I will also talk about in the songs of Traveler Opus 8. Interestingly, the manuscript of this piece was considered lost for many years and was only found in 1986. Can you guess where? In the library of the Music Academy, now the University of Music in Warsaw. It lay there in the library, and all the time no one knew it was there until it was found in 1986. So we have the manuscript of the piece. Paderewski played the elegy publicly several times. For the first time in 1882 in Łętów, even before the piece was published. And in the following years he played it only 4 times in total. Later he did not include it in the repertoire of his concert, so this piece was not particularly known or performed. The elegy begins with a solitary F, repeated 3 times, each time with gradually decreasing dynamics. Piano, pianissimo, piano, pianissimo. In this technique, one can find an illustration of church bells at a funeral or departing into eternity, fading life. These 3 resonating sounds will return several times during the composition, serving as a kind of leitmotif, an idea fix, and at the same time a binding element of the piece. After the last of the 3 tones, I mentioned a figure reminiscent of the medieval Dies Irae chant appears. The motive, realized by both hands in unison, introduces the main theme of the elegy, Con dolore, which you can see here in the sheet music. Poetic in expression, it conveys dual feelings. On the one hand, mourning and sadness for the loss of a loved one, on the other, intimacy and sometimes even fervor of emotion. It's as if we were both declaration of love and the final farewell at the same time. In the piece, you can find almost all shades of human emotions: the intimacy of a love confession, the fervor of emotion, passion, moments of desperation, deep sorrow, sadness, but also solace, peace, and hope. Let's listen to the beginning of this poignant piece, the elegy in B-flat minor by Ignacy Paderewski.
Taki fragmencik.
That's a snippet of it.
Tańce polskie.
Polish dances. Polish dances opus 5 and opus 9. Two cycles of musical stylizations based on the characteristic melodic rhythmic features of Polish dances.
Tańców. Opus 5.
In opus 5 of the cycle, we have 3 dances: Krakowiak, Mazurka, Krakowiak, and in opus 9 there are more of them. Indeed, there are Krakowiaks, Mazurkas, and concluding the cycle, the only Polonaise in B major in Paderewski's work. Although Paderewski does not use quotes, original folk melodies like Chopin, he adeptly and sensibly captures the idiom of this musical style. Indeed, the cycles of Polish dances, opus 9 and opus 5, are the works in which Chopin's influences are most noticeable. What's characteristic in these pieces is the simple, clear constructional schemes and regular internal structure, the typical ABA reprise model, the use of a dotted rhythm or double dotted. Here there are 2 names. Paderewski uses it repeatedly in his compositions. It may even constitute a characteristic feature of his compositional style because we can encounter this technique in many of his works. Also characteristic, I think you can already see it on the first page of this Krakowiak in E major, are frequent tempo changes, such fluctuations, suspensions, accelerations. Every few bars there is an 𝐼𝐸𝐾𝐿, whether più lento, ritenuto, rallentando, più mosso, again ritenuto calando. This is also a characteristic feature of Paderewski's work and results in a feeling of flexibility, spontaneity, while at the same time bringing the music closer to the roots of folk music. Although one could wonder to what extent this might have been a different version of Mazurkas or Krakowiaks compared to Chopin's Mazurkas, who very rarely used such indications. Perhaps Paderewski, going with the spirit of the times, wanted to accurately capture his artistic vision of these pieces and precisely mark where he expected the performer to use tempo rubato and where not. The cycle of Polish dances, opus 5, begins with the Krakowiak in E major, a very beautiful piece. I will perform it at the concert today, but time is pressing, so I won't present it here. Instead, I will introduce the second piece from the cycle, the Mazurka in E minor, also very beautiful. Paderewski's first Mazurka in his work. I consider it the most beautiful of them all, with a moderate tempo. Interestingly, it utilizes the gypsy scale with its characteristic augmented second. And there are also elements typical of folk music, doubling of melodies in thirds, the presence of a constant note known as a drone, and significant agogic flexibility, as I mentioned. We can also find a rhythm with double dotting here. Here's a snippet of the Mazurka in E minor from the Polish dances, opus 5.
Mazurek e-moll z cyklu tańców polskich opus 5. I myślę na zakończenie opowiem Państwu
in conclusion, I will briefly tell you about the introduction toccata, opus 6. This piece is of a larger format, created between 1881 and 1882. And interestingly, Paderewski played this piece for 𝗬𝐿𝐼𝐸 𝐃𝐙 and Friedrich Kiel in Berlin, where it made a big impression. I have a quote in which Paderewski wrote to 𝗬𝐿𝐼𝐸 𝐃𝐙, his friend and violinist. Then, because 𝗬𝐿𝐼𝐸 and Kiel wanted it, I played the introduction toccata. I don't know what happened to me. I played perfectly, didn't make more than 60 mistakes, and when I finished, Kiel patted me on the shoulder and said, "Beautiful, very beautiful, splendid virtuoso, colossal technique." and nice touch. This piece consists of two parts, a concise, majestic introduction and a motoric, virtuosic toccata.
No, żeby już nie przedłużać, puszczę Państwu, żeby kawałek tej introdukcji.
I will play you a snippet of this introduction to listen to.
How truly majestic this introduction is. And finally, the ending of the toccata, so you can hear what a virtuosic piece it is. And that's all as far as my presentation is concerned. I hope I've shed some light on the early lesser-known works of Ignacy and Paderewski and encourage you to explore them. I think everyone can find something for themselves. There are lyrical miniatures such as the elegy, there are truly virtuosic pieces like the introduction toccata, as well as beautiful mazurkas, krakowiaks from the cycle of Polish dances, opus 5 and 9, and also pieces with elements of archaism, like the minuet or prelude couplets. I believe they are very diverse, beautiful, and worth performing, which I highly encourage you to do. Thank you very much.